So thanks for joining us, everyone. I'm Scott Oeth, Cahill Financial Advisors, and joined with special guest, Leslie Geller, Advanced Wealth Strategist with Capital Group. And this is another one of our wealth strategy sessions that we're running. This is, I think one of the really fun things for us that's come out of one of the positives that's come out of the pandemic is getting more comfortable using this type of technology and being able to share and reach a lot of folks at once and just share a lot of ideas, especially in things that might be more specialty or niche topics. Like I think what we're going to focus on today, it isn't necessarily a broad-based strategy that's applicable to everyone, but it works really well in certain situations. And so what we want to focus on is talk a bit about overview of the estate planning environment, what's happening there, and then really spend some time talking about an area of family limited partnerships. And myself, my team at Cahill, I think we're very good at understanding the broad landscape, using financial planning, talking about what's important to people, what they're trying to achieve, their hopes and dreams and their fears and what keeps them up at night, and look at the analytical things, the nuts and bolts, and look at the soft stuff and marry it together. And so we have a good broad scope, and I think we know quite a bit, but we don't know everything. And there's a lot of specialty areas, whether it comes to certain areas of advice where we need the client to go and actually implement something. We recommend insurance strategies, but we don't sell insurance. We don't earn any commissions. So something like that, or refinance your home or rental property. And so we have a nice team behind us of experts and people we can tap. And Leslie is in that category. And I was at the Investment and Wealth Institute conference in Nashville this summer, Leslie, and you gave this wonderful advanced tax planning for high net worth families. And it was remarkable. I mean, how long was that? And
oh my gosh, it was over 2 hours of, it was a long, I was tired after that one.
I can imagine. I imagine it was a real tour de force. And, I've been to many conference presentations and many different topics, but what was really cool about that event is how you had built it all into a case study of a family with lots of different issues going on, and then had little breakout times for us to work on that. And so anyway, Leslie is one of the people or the types of folks that we can lean on and like to call, if we're looking for more specialized support and knowledge in certain areas. And so excited to dive into this one. But I guess to finish up sort of the introduction and maybe some of the housekeeping details, you're with Capital Group American Funds, which is a long-standing, very prominent investment management firm. And you're in the advanced planning and advisor education department, which we really appreciate. And before that, you had a distinguished career in the legal field, working with high net worth families for a couple different law firms, and specializing, I believe, in tax and estate planning. Is that correct? Yeah.
Yes, exactly.
But of course, that type of work touches so many different areas, right? As you're business owners and high net worth families. A few technical notes. We are definitely open to questions. Maybe save those to the end. You can type them in. I'll try and keep an eye on those and maybe either work them into the conversation or address them at the end. And if you have any follow-up questions, please feel free to reach out to me. You can get in contact to us with Cahill Financial Advisors or through my blog, scottoeth.com. Happy to talk further. And, to stay in the good graces of the compliance department, the standard disclosure that they always want us to put out there. First of all, we're talking about general concepts here. This is educational purposes. Nothing that we're talking about here is supposed to be interpreted as specific advice or recommendations for any particular person, watching. Be sure to seek your own counsel and do your own research and understand the pros and cons of these types of strategies and how they may apply to your situation. And also, we're completely independent. So Cahill Financial Advisors is not owned. We're not representatives. We're not financially affiliated with Capital Group American Funds. Likewise, Capital Group American Funds has no financial ties to Cahill Financial Advisors, and each of our opinions are our own, right? So anything I missed in the intro, or anything else you think is important that we should know about you or your role or Capital Group?
No. I mean, this is this is what I do. I talk to advisors, I talk to investors all about tax policy, tax planning. So I get a great perspective on what's going on in the planning world. We have great resources in-house on the ground in DC, so we know what's coming, we know what's not coming. And so I think hopefully this information will be really helpful, relevant, actionable, just give you some ideas to start thinking about.
Great, great. Well, I think maybe to kick it off, the strategy we're talking about has a particular application in the area of wealth transfer, intergenerational wealth transfer, and estate tax planning. Maybe can you give us a bit of an overview in terms of where we're at in the estate tax scheme and what some of the issues are for wealthy families?
Yeah, so gifting has been a real big area of conversation with high net worth families over the last couple of years, because of all of the threatened changes in the tax world that we've had to contend with. And one of the big threatened changes over the last couple of years, and not just the last couple of years, it's always sort of kind of this political football, is the lifetime exemption amount from the gift and estate tax. So currently, the exemption amount is $12.06 million per person. It was $11.7 million last year. It's adjusted every year for inflation. So as you might imagine, there is going to be a big jump next year. It is going to be increased, what I've heard, by almost $1 million next year. So we will be close to $13 million of exemption for each individual starting next year. And that exemption means that you can give during your life or at death, not both, up to $12.06 million without the application of the 40% gift and estate tax, right? And so as of now, the gift and estate tax is really just a problem for the very wealthy, right? Because a couple has to have $24 million plus to have to worry about the gift and estate tax. However, that number, that exemption amount, whatever it is at the end of 2025, will be cut in half. So we will go from, let's say, 14 million of exemption per person, if that's what it is at the end of 2025, to 7 million of exemption. So even though we have big numbers right now, in a few years, we are going to have half of what we're working with at that time. And for very wealthy families, that is a very big deal, right? There are a lot more couples with $12, $14 million assets, right? Plus than $25 million plus. And so the gift and estate tax is going to become a problem for a much larger swath of the high net worth population within the next few years. And that's a significant shift, particularly for that Gen X kind of sandwich generation that's just starting to think about transferring. And so that's sort of that's the big kind of policy context in the gift and estate tax world. And I get the question every time I talk about that. It's like, do you actually think it's going to sunset? Do you actually think they're going to let it be cut in half at the end of 2025? Right. And I actually think they will, because if they do nothing, that's what happens. And it's hard to see, first of all, them doing anything. I think we've all seen over the last couple of years.
Yeah.
The estate tax is not a big money maker. It's not big from a revenue perspective, right? It's kind of a drop in the bucket. It's really more of like a symbolic messaging thing. And it's really hard for anyone to argue that they need to keep a $14 million exemption per person, right? That's a tough policy position to take these days. So I actually do think it will be cut in half at the end of 2025.
Yeah, I mean, political swings and what's happening economically and with federal budget, and we've seen it. In my career, when I started, it was $625,000 per person,
right?
And so it's crazy to think about where it's at now. It's 675,000 for a few years in the late 90s, and we were talking about a lot of these strategies with people who had .com wealth, or here in the Midwest, there's a lot of family farms where they're looking at that and saying, oh wow, 1.2 million and change for a couple. We're cash poor. We're farmers. We don't have a fat bank account, but the value of our land and our equipment and
Yeah.
our animals are well over that. And so, we've seen these things fluctuate. I think we even had a year there where zero, and then it flipped back and forth. And so,
Mm-hmm.
but of all the tax laws, some seem to stay fairly consistent, even though there's a lot of talk. Watch
Yep.
what is the effective rate. But the estate tax has had quite a few swings, and that sunset is looming. The countdown is happening.
Yeah.
And it
Yeah.
is finalized. That's one half. I feel like for a while there's a discussion
So
potentially inflation indexed as to where
yeah,
it's
so what
off.
it is, that's sort of my shortcut way of
Okay.
thinking about it.
Yeah.
It's what it will be cut to is 5 million as adjusted for inflation.
Right.
And
Okay.
sort of a rough
Yeah.
calculation,
Yeah.
it will end up being roughly half of
Right.
what it is
Yeah.
then.
Yeah.
Right. So it won't be exactly half, but that's kind of how I think about it in my head
Right.
for guesstimating purposes.
Understood. Yeah. And that's federal, right?
Mhm.
So
Yep.
states have
And
their
you
own
guys
estate
in
tax. Yeah.
Minnesota, you have a much smaller exemption,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm. 3 million per
Yep.
person.
Yep.
3 million, and it's not as high of a rate as the federal level, but it's still significant bite. 13 up to 16%, I believe. When you're over 3 million, so it's certainly something that we see a lot more people, kind of caught up at that level.
Do you see people move out of Minnesota as they get older to try to avoid that?
What I would say is surprisingly not as many as
Yeah.
you would think,
Right.
actually. So we did one of these sessions, Leslie, a few months ago, had
Mm-hmm.
an estate attorney, a CPA, and another advanced planning person. We had a great round table. So anyone's listening who'd like to hear more about that subject, we've got it up on my blog. And we had a really good discussion about income taxes and estate taxes and property taxes and cost of living and all the issues that go into that. And certainly we do. So we live in an area, like I mentioned, it was in the 20s in October here, and in January we can hit 20 below. So we have a lot of snowbirds, a lot of people who like to spend
Yep.
time down south, and
Yep.
some of those folks spend enough time, and they go through the process of establishing residency in Florida, some in Texas. We have a lot of people like Arizona. That's not to say no state tax, but it's better than
Right.
it's less punishing than Minnesota, and Nevada with clients in Washington state, and so a number of these states with no tax. And so it does come into play, but also it is interesting, because it'll come up in conversation. We talk through it, and quite a few people, even though they are spending a few months out of the year in Arizona or Florida, they don't, or they don't go through that extra step, or they just don't want the complexity and the hassle of tracking the days and establishing the residence. And so, but that may change, I think, also as
Yeah.
time goes on and their personal situation changes. So
Yeah. I think state taxation, both from a estate and gift tax and an income tax perspective, is going to become a much larger part of the conversation. It already is, right? But I think states are kind of taking two potential avenues, right? There's either this race to the bottom, like Nevada, Florida, New Hampshire,
Tennessee,
all of these, yes, Tennessee, right? All that, or there's states that are just, like California, which just keep piling it on.
yeah.
Right. And so it's going to be interesting to see how the state taxation issue evolves, and how states kind of take things into their own hands over the next decade or so.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thanks for that overview. So we talked about spending some time really focusing on this one particular strategy. I imagine you could probably talk about it for days. We could do a whole conference on family limited partnerships. But maybe can you give us an overview of what is this strategy, and how does it work? What are we talking about with flips or family limited partnerships?
Yeah. And so I think, first of all, we're talking about family limited partnerships, but in this conversation, I think you also have to acknowledge that you're often talking about family LLCs as well, right? They have a lot of the same attributes and utility. When I stopped practicing, we were actually seeing far more LLCs than FLPs, because LLCs provide theoretically better asset protection, right? Because
Mhm.
everybody has limited liability as opposed to just the limited partners in a
Wow.
family limited
Yeah.
partnership. And you can effectively mimic the general partner, limited partner kind of dual membership class structure within an LLC by creating two classes of LLC membership. So you
I
can
see.
effectively get the benefits
Mhm.
of an FLP with an FLLC. And so when we talk about FLPs, right, we're sort of talking about
Okay.
both.
Umbrella generic
Yes.
term. Yeah.
Right. Like
Okay.
we call it family holding companies is
Right.
what we call them.
Okay.
And they are used as part of a usually a wealth transfer or planning strategy within a family to accomplish a number of things, right? Asset protection, centralization of management, and then tax efficient transfer of wealth, right?
Mm.
That is what they provide. They are one of my favorite elements of planning strategies, right? They are seldom used on their own. They are often part of a larger wealth transfer strategy, right? So you take the family investment portfolio, you take the family real estate portfolio, and you wrap it in an FLP or family LLC, right?
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
then you gift membership interests or partnership interests to a trust, or a trust purchases membership interests from the LLC or FLP. So they are often part of a larger wealth transfer strategy. They're often seen in GRATs, right? In GRAT structures. So those types of structures that transfer not the current value of an asset, but future appreciation,
Right. Right.
right? You often wrap the assets that you're putting into a GRAT in an LLC or
Mhm.
LP to make the transfers easier, right? And that's one of the other big benefits is ease of transferability, right? So if you
Mhm.
think about one great example is like private equity assets, right? Or positions in a fund. Sometimes it's really hard to transfer those positions directly,
Right.
or there's
Right.
certain lockup periods, but it's really easy to transfer an LLC interest that holds one of those private equity positions,
Mhm.
right? So it allows for ease of transferability as well. So
Mhm.
they provide a million different benefits. They can be used in a million different ways to really suit the family's goals as far as control, tax efficiency, centralization of management, asset protection. So they were almost always part of the conversation when we were talking about wealth transfer for high net worth families.
So very commonly used. And I think one of the things, I mean, the family part just means that's who you're choosing to involve. It's not necessarily that in the tax code it says this has to be your family.
Exactly.
It's really you're saying all those potential advantages. You want to transfer, difficult to transfer assets. There's some tax advantages we'll get into, potentially asset protection. You've got, Gen 1 or Gen 2, wherever, someone who's accumulated some wealth and they're wondering about sharing some of the ownership, but retaining control. And so they say, let's put these assets in a legal entity, either a
Yep.
limited partnership or an LLC. And the assets, as you mentioned, they could be private equity, they could be real estate, it could be big block of company stock that an
Hmm.
executive earned, it could be family business. What else goes in there? Farm, traded securities, right? I mean,
Yes. Yep.
okay. So,
Really, really
yeah.
anything. Really
Mhm,
anything.
mhm.
And I mean, depending on the family's goals, right? You may have multiple LLCs, right? Where you've got
Mhm.
one holding real estate, you have one holding the investment accounts, one holding the private equity position, right? Sometimes it makes sense to keep everything separate like that. Sometimes it makes sense to squish everything together so that you can transfer representative pieces of each of those asset classes in a really easy way to lower
Mhm.
generations.
Mhm. Mhm. So you put it in this type of entity, and then there's some special control features, isn't there, between
Yeah.
general and limited partnership? You want to tell us a bit about how
Yeah.
that works? Or you mentioned
So,
different classes and
yep.
in the, yeah.
Yeah. And so one of the roadblocks we would often encounter in talking to, matriarch or patriarch about transferring the real estate portfolio they built from scratch, right? Or their business they built from scratch, or an asset that was very important to them
Right.
that they still wanted to control is, well, I recognize the need to use up my exemption amount, right? I recognize that I should start thinking about moving assets downstream, but I don't want to give up control of this, right? This is mine. My kids aren't ready, or I want to gradually transition control. And that's where these FLPs or FLLCs can play a really vital role. Is they're one of those have your cake and eat it too strategies. So if you take the family real estate portfolio, you put it into an FLP, right? Matriarch or patriarch can be the general partner of that FLP.
So they're still calling the shots.
They are in charge of everything,
Yep.
right? They decide what to charge for rent on the rental properties. They decide when distributions are made to the FLPs, to the LPs. They decide when properties are sold, right? They decide if they want to reinvest proceeds in something totally different, right?
Right.
They are still in charge. They get to retain that control, but they then transfer LP interests to trusts for children and grandchildren.
Yep. Limited partner. Yep.
Limited partners
General
means
partner. Yep.
Yep. And so they get to keep that control while at the same time transferring value out of their estate and accomplishing their wealth transfer goals. So that's why I call it that have your cake and eat it too structure. And LLCs work the same way, right? You have kind of a managing membership interest, right? So that would equate to the general partner. And then you have an ordinary member interest that doesn't have any control, doesn't have any say. So same idea, you get to keep control of all the decisions, all the management, but move the value out of your estate and accomplish those wealth transfer goals.
Yeah, which is really fairly unique, right? Because that is a common concern, the idea of giving up control. Okay, I want to start building financial acumen in the next generation, some sense of stewardship, including them, but not quite ready, or I want to still make the decisions for one reason or another. But there's kind of a general concept in tax law, this for a gift to be completed.
Right.
There's not supposed to be strings attached to it, right? There's not supposed to be sort of this puppeteer dangling, but in this context, there is a bit, there's a lot of that. The general partner is still having the say in managing things, but the dollar value is being transferred down to the asset side of the balance sheet of other members in the family, which, can take it out of the donor's estate tax regime. And then, like you'd mentioned before, not only today, but all the future growth on that occurs down in those next generations.
Yep. And with those types of strategies, those have your cake and eat it too strategies, it's really important to follow the plan and stick with the formalities, follow what the documents say, right? You can't decide to make non-pro rata distributions to sorry, that was my littlest daughter just walked in to say goodbye. You can't totally disregard the partnership agreement, right? And use the assets or the accounts for your personal expenses. You can't make distributions to your favorite children, but not the other children that own LP interest, right? It's really important to follow the formalities, to follow what the documents say, right? As opposed to, not coloring within the lines, particularly with these types of strategies, because you don't want to show, like you said, Scott, you don't want to show that you have control outside of what the documents provide. Right.
You got to play by the rules.
Yep.
And otherwise you're at risk of it all being disregarded, right? And then the strategy blows up. I suppose important point, you need sufficient assets outside of what you're putting into the family holding company for your own lifestyle and your fun stuff that you're spending money on. And I mean, these really are assets that you're gearing towards transferring to the next generation. Would that be fair to say?
Yeah. Yeah, if you want to, now there's circumstances where, you know, the client, you intend to keep control of 51% until you die, right? And in that case, sure, go ahead and transfer
Yeah.
everything as long as you're, you know, the facts support the structure. But if, yes, the goal is to give away everything, then certainly you want to have enough assets outside of that structure that looks like you really intended to give away and give up control at some point over those assets. Yes, those facts, those outside facts in the context matter quite a bit if it's ever challenged.
This is one of the really interesting areas I'm enjoying diving into in the financial planning context. You know, tend to think of like the financial modeling and look at Monte Carlo simulations as looking at, you know, retirement security, and that's a wonderful application. And for a lot of people, that's the number one goal. But when you start getting into situations where it's clear there's enough, you know, using that type of tool and that type of modeling to carve out and say, how much is needed to support, you know, your lifestyle, and then how much is really probably legacy funds. And I think it really helps with the decision making, and opens things up a bit to really start exploring, saying, well, okay, we could do more gifting to family, we could do more gifting to charity, we could spend some of that money on something that's just really fun and not feel like it all needs to be kept in kind of this this core security pot. And so we've been talking more and more about that. You know, it's easy when you're looking at something like a Monte Carlo simulation where we're wrapping all the assets and income and projecting it forward and stress testing to say, well, you're at a 95% Monte Carlo simulation versus a 98%, or, you know, 85, which would still say is a very, very strong projection, versus 95. Well, what does that mean? I mean, it might be a lot more meaningful to those people to be able to identify how much is needed to support, say, a very strong 75% projection. In all likelihood, that's going to do very well for them. And then the dollars that would fund that extra amount, that could be the budget for something like family holding company or advanced gifting, or any number of things. So
yeah.
Along those lines, I mean, you say really interesting strategy. Probably not for everyone. What type of wealth level do you commonly see this start to make sense at?
I mean, it's not a huge lift from a setting up perspective or an administrative perspective. And so even for clients that were kind of at the start of their gifting journey, we would almost always incorporate it in some way. Yes, you have to have enough money so that you can give away something, right? But even when somebody was, you know, say they had a position in a startup that was worth $1 million right now, or $500,000 right now, but the expectation was that it would blow up in value 10x within the next 5 years, right? We would say, let's get this into an LLC now, so that we have the structure in place so that you can transfer it easily when it's time, right? That so you can use your annual exclusion gifts, that 16,000 per person per year, to transfer little pieces of that every year. It just makes the whole wealth transfer conversation a lot easier from an administration and implementation perspective. And, you know, it's the setup fee, right? It's having the operating agreement or the partnership agreement drafted, which when it's simple is not that heavy of a lift. So, you know, unlike some of the more complex techniques, right? Setting up, you know, some of these dynasty trust in no tax states, right? Or rolling grat structures like that, you have to have a lot of money, and a lot of money now, to justify those. But the LLC or the FLP, those are kind of, you know, there's really no reason not to include them in a wealth transfer structure. I think because you can design them very simply. They can be really complex. So you can have 5 different classes of membership or partners, LP interests that have different rights and obligations or control. You can do that, right? And it's absolutely done. But there's also very simple versions that provide some really big benefits. And I mean, the primary one, and I think we'll probably get to this, are the discounts, right? The discounts that you are achieved just by wrapping assets in an FLP or an FLLC.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And
yeah, maybe just, I mean, because
yeah,
you're talking about setting up an LLC or a limited partnership. I mean, you can file that with the Secretary of State on your
yeah,
own. I mean, I'm not
absolutely.
advising that, or that's not my recommendation,
No.
but literally you could, right? I mean, that in
Yep.
theory is what we're talking about.
Legal Zoom, right? Like
Yep.
I actually have done that. Like with legal,
Mhm.
it's so easy.
Mhm.
Yes, it's $1,000 in fees and stuff
Mhm.
every year, but it makes things easier down the line.
Yeah, I definitely want to talk about the discounted valuations, because that's maybe one of the other just
Yeah.
really unique parts of this. But what about the people on the other end, the limited partners or the recipients? I mean, can they touch, can they use that money? Is it just the income coming off that? If you're thinking about the structure of the gift, there's some real advantages with this. But, if the kids or grandkids, they're thinking about first house or college or, those types of things, what about access to those funds? Is it
Yeah.
tied up or is it available?
So it totally depends,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
And so what I think usually it's seen as a benefit, right?
Mhm.
If for
Yeah,
grandma
yeah,
or grandpa or
yeah,
mom or
yeah.
dad, is that the kids or grandkids really have nothing other than a piece of paper
Mhm.
until you decide they have something as LPs or as members of the LLC, right? So let's say you transfer a 25% limited partnership interest to a trust for your kids, right? Or you give them each a 25% interest in an individual trust for their benefit. All the trust has is a 25% LP interest or 25% LLC interest. That is all they have until you decide as the general partner, as the managing member of the LLC, to make a distribution to the LPs, right? And you have to do it on a representative basis. So if they own 25%, they get 25% of the distribution.
Mhm.
And then those funds go into the trust that owns that 25% interest. But at that point, you actually, if you've given the interest to a trust, you have another layer of control because you've got the trustee who's in charge of those funds.
Okay.
You
Yeah.
have the distribution scheme in that trust, right? And so there's sort of two layers of asset protection, of protection from themselves, from
Mhm.
future ex-spouses, right? We see them a
Mhm.
lot in that type
Mhm.
of situation. That's a very compelling
Yeah.
reason to set these up sometimes for parents or grandparents keeping
Right.
assets in the family. Um, and so, you know, for the LPs, for the members that don't have control over the LLC, they really don't have anything other than a piece of paper until the person who's in control decides to give them, right, some type of interest, right? If the partnership agreement provides that each year they get a distribution in an amount to pay taxes, right? Because remember, these entities provide are pass through taxation, yeah,
Right.
right? And so they're not taxed on an entity basis. All tax liability is passed through to the
Right.
partners or the members if the LLC is taxed as a partnership. So the partnership agreement may mandate distributions at certain times, but usually in this type of situation, it is left to the discretion to some degree of that general partner or of the managing member.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah. Very, very interesting. You touched on something that I think is, I try and introduce the concept to people, and that is, um, you'd mentioned this idea of sort of pre-building a prenuptial type agreement for your kids. If you're looking and saying, yes, I want to help my kids out. Maybe they're early, they're in a relationship, you're not sure how things are going to go. Sadly, a lot of marriages end in divorce, and you certainly want to provide for their family, but you don't necessarily want to see your family wealth become diluted. Even I think about the impact of spending and credit score and those decisions. And so whether it's in your estate documents, creating a trust that simply holds assets for the benefit of your kids and holds those assets indefinitely. Distributions can be made for their benefit, but instead of them just getting a check that goes into the
Yeah.
family checkbook and gets blended with everything else and spent on different things, that type of decision? Or as you're saying in this scenario where money could be there and it could be there for your kids, your grandkids, but protected to a large degree from being halved in a divorce, or you touched on asset protection a few times, right? So
and I think the times I've seen asset protection play out in the most positive and effective way is when a trust was created, or an LLC, or both, for the family, and that trust or structure is in place when the child or grandchild gets sued, or when the child or grandchild gets divorced, right? It is really, really hard to pierce a trust structure, particularly when it's combined with an LLC, right? It works very, very well.
And in place ahead of the time.
Yes.
As opposed to, oops, I did something, or I'm being accused of something.
It should just
what do I
be
do now?
It should just be the default. And then like, instead of, I always sit, because I get the question, well, my kids are great. Like, my kids are fully competent. I totally trust them, but I understand that I need to protect them from our society, the world, right? Litigious society and future ex-spouses and all that. But I would like to give them more access control as they get older. And instead of requiring distributions, whether it's out of the LLC or out of a trust, I always say give them the option of more control, right? So have them come in as general partner or co-managing member of the LLC, or have them come in as co-trustee or sole trustee of the trust for their benefit at a certain age. Because then if everything's great, they don't have liabilities, the trust isn't really justified, doesn't have enough to keep it around, whatever, it makes sense, they can just distribute it out to themselves, right? Or if they're about to go through a messy divorce, they don't accept that leadership role because they don't want any control at that point as they're going through that divorce. So the default should be the most protective it can be, with added layers of flexibility should circumstances allow for it.
Then it's like they don't have to pick it up. Like, oh, I can't, one of the things I will encourage people to think about, or I'll put out there for them, is, over the years, I've had these conversations with many people, and when they get to the maybe later stages in life and they have more money than they expected they're going to, and estate tax laws have changed, the limits are low, and all of a sudden it looks like that, there's often a lot of kind of gymnastics and head scratching and consulting with high-priced attorneys who are wonderful. You're trying to figure out, how do we get this money out of their personal name and into trust, right? So if you're on the upstroke and you're growing and you're starting to really to accumulate wealth, why not build it there in the first place? Because it's a whole lot easier to do that than to try and get it out later on.
Right? That's a really great point. And I was talking to somebody yesterday, and he was saying, okay, so I have a client that can afford to give away $6 million right now, right? That's like the max he can afford to give away. And he's really pushing back on making the gift now, because he's saying, well, even if the exemption is cut in half at the end of 2025, it's not going to be less than 6. So I'll be able to give 6 million in 2026, just like I can now. And I get what he's trying to go for there, but hopefully that $6 million asset is going to be worth $8 or $9 million in 2026. And so what he's missing out on is all of that movement of future appreciation out of the estate as well, right? And so yes, that exemption amount matters, and how much you can afford to move matters, but that future appreciation, right, building that additional wealth and appreciation outside of the estate, as you were saying, is a really, really important concept.
All right, so I have one more question with you, is we're kind of getting back, talking taxes, asset protections come into play. Leslie, the other night I was up late watching TV and it's getting real sleepy, and this commercial comes on and it's kind of grainy, low budget, and it's, call 1-800 something 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 to have my Nevada trust set up. And what about situs of these? Or is that something that you're typically talking about? How important would that be in terms of the mechanics? We talked about decisions around state taxes for income taxes and estate planning, but what about the entities themselves?
It doesn't really matter. I think if you are trying to avoid state income tax in a high income tax state like California, and the LLC or FLP is part of a structure that you're setting up in Delaware, in Nevada, then it makes sense to have an entity, an LLC or an FLP, that is set up under the laws of that particular state. Right? If you're going for that state income tax planning, if you're going for that, I want this trust to continue for generations and generations, that dynasty trust planning that you can do in some of these states like Delaware and Nevada.
South Dakota.
Yes, South Dakota. Then it makes sense to have an entity that is set up, governed, established under the laws of that particular state, right? If you're just doing regular old estate planning, wealth transfer planning, you're not trying to do anything super sophisticated in that way, then, we'll have clients set up a California LLC, right? So Delaware and Nevada have the most developed laws around asset protection, right? And so that around, allowing for these generational trusts, and that's why ultra high net worth families who are doing some really sophisticated planning will often opt for planning done in that state.
Yeah. Well, so far we've talked about this interesting concept. You explained how at the federal level, everyone has a fairly large coupon essentially now against the federal estate tax. And then there's state limits, but this is going to get cut down in approximately half in 2026, we think. And a lot of people have wealth that's growing, maybe dipping along the way, but it will be growing. And so you've talked about the strategy of the family holding company, a couple different designs, and how you can transfer value to other family members, but still retain control, a really unique feature, some of the asset protection angles of it. But there's this really juicy part, right? that gets, so we've got about a $12 million coupon, and let's say things have gone really well and you have $50 million, and you're trying to maximize the amount that you're able to pass on. Can you talk to us about valuation discounts and how that works?
Yeah. So valuation discounts are one of the big benefits in using these types of wrapper structures. And the whole idea is that, so if you have a $4 million real estate portfolio, right? And you transfer the 25% piece of that real estate portfolio, right? Just that real estate. The value of that would be $1 million, right? And so you would use up $1 million of your lifetime exemption to transfer that 25% piece of the real estate to your children, grandchildren. Same goes for, a portfolio of marketable securities, right? That's a quarter is $1 million. Now, let's say you take that same real estate portfolio, that same swath of marketable securities, and you put it into an FLP, right, or an LLC. You want to transfer that same 25% interest. Is that interest worth $1 million, right? Because it represents $1 million in value. Is it worth $1 million? Well, the law says it's not, because as a limited partner, as a member in an LLC that can't exercise any management control, what you have from an economic perspective is not representative of a quarter of $4 million. So there are these things called discounts. So lack of marketability discount, lack of control discount. There's a few others. Minority interest discount, right? This idea that you have no control over your quarter of the asset, right? You may not get dividends until the GP says you do. You may not get distributions until the GP says you do. So it's not really reflective of $1 million. And so maybe that quarter LP interest, that 25% LP interest, that's only worth, with the discount applied, $750,000, right? And
Mhm.
so when you gift that 25% LP interest, you don't have to use up $1 million of exemption to transfer it. You only have to use up $750,000 of exemption to transfer it, right? You get a 25% discount on that minority interest, right?
Mhm.
And there's a range of discounts.
Right.
How aggressive or conservative you are depends on the situation, depends on the structure of the entity, of the FLP, of the FLLC,
Mhm.
depends on the asset.
Mhm.
You can have multiple layers of discounts. Usually they range anywhere from 15% to 40% on the really aggressive side, with somewhere between like 20 and 20, 25 is sort of the
Yeah.
sweet spot, I think.
Right.
But if you're talking about big dollars, that is a very, very big point of leverage when you're
Mhm.
trying to transfer as much as you can using the exemption that you have. And so that's how these discounts work. And this is another area where it's super important to follow the formalities,
Yeah,
right?
for
You
sure.
may need to get a discount appraisal, right?
Right.
You need
Right.
a valuation firm to come in and say, these are the assets, this is the structure, this is the discounts that go along
Right.
with
Right.
this structure or transaction. So you have something to show the IRS or the state taxing authority.
Right.
But valuations are really, really powerful when you're
Yeah.
looking for leverage and moving these assets.
Yeah, it's amazing. That makes sense. I mean, if you just take a portfolio of publicly traded stocks and bonds, they're worth $1 million, and you put it in this structure and say because of the nature of it, you're giving these limited partnership interests. Well, you get to squish down that value from, let's call it a modest discount, a 15% discount, from 1 million to $850,000.
Yeah.
Boy, that's significant.
Yes.
But if the type of asset that you're gifting, let's say it's a closely held business, something like that, and it's worth $1 million, you might be able to squish it down legitimately to 600,000 or something,
Yep.
because not only does that limited partnership have a lack of control, but I mean, it's not publicly traded stock that can just be sold on the open market just like that. There's a liquidity issue and a marketability issue, and that's where you're talking kind of the appraisal for what's a
Yep.
reasonable. But it's interesting because this is the other side. We talked about that special string, being able to have your cake and eat it too, give away assets and transfer them and still retain them. So there's that advantage for the grantor. This is kind of on the other side of that, saying because they still have that control,
Yep.
the person receiving it is not deemed to have received as large of a gift, even though in reality, there those dollars sit on their balance sheet, and if the value of them grows over time, the full value is there, right? It just, in real life, it
Yep.
might not be as accessible and it's not as easy to work with. But so for the tax purposes, it's a bit of financial magic.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It is. And they have been like these family valuation discounts. They've been attacked so
Yeah.
many times.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they were on the chopping block with the IRS just like 4 or 5 years ago. I think there were
Mm-hmm.
proposed regulations that came out that pretty much would have like eliminated the ability to use these types of family entity valuation discounts. And they never they never did it. It's just it's too hard, it's too controversial. I just don't think there's that much potential revenue tied up in there.
Yeah.
It's one of
Right.
those like very niche issues.
Right.
And it's so complicated that these proposed regulations came out, everybody panicked, and then nothing ever happened.
One of those areas it's very tough to put guidelines around, right?
Yeah.
Because
Yeah, because
what are we talking
they'll
about? What
just
type of
find another. Yeah.
assets? And yeah, very interesting. Well, you'd mentioned a time or two, the importance of really following the rules, coloring within the lines. What other pitfalls, or where would this not
Yeah.
be indicated?
Yeah. I mean, I think the bad facts are pretty obvious, right? So getting greedy with discounts, right? If you try to take a 70% or 80% discount, that's, a
Right.
red flag.
Yeah.
Not following the formalities. So treating the LLC or FLP funds as your personal bank account, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
Distributing, not following the distribution rules
Mhm.
under the partnership agreement,
Okay.
right? So, like I said, distributing more to your favorite kid, not doing the pro rata distributions, right? That looks like you're retaining control beyond what is dictated in the document, which will be deemed a string for purposes of estate
Mhm.
tax, which can bring
Mhm.
everything back into your estate.
Mhm.
Um, not just a piece, everything.
Mhm.
And so I think, those are the biggest pitfalls. And then also, too, I think the other place I would see people get uh, or amass potential liability is just not keeping up with the documentation, right? So, especially happens with, FLPs or FLLCs that are started very early on in the wealth building process, and then they become like this really big thing. And you've got multiple branches of the family involved, and there's nobody really in charge. And all of a sudden it's, well, the documentation is no longer representative of the economics or the control structure because we just haven't kept up
Mhm.
with that. That happens all the time. And then you can have 30, 40, 50 million dollars of value at stake, and nobody knows really who's in
Right.
charge, right?
Right. Right.
Or what the economics should be. I think that is the other place where so often we were cleaning up messes,
Mhm.
or,
Mhm.
uncovering big mistakes that had been made in distributions, right? Or
Yeah.
ownership structure on the estate tax returns. So I think getting greedy on the valuations, not following formalities, and then not keeping up with the documentation is
Mhm.
probably the three biggest areas.
Mhm. Is there a typical point where the whole structure might just be dissolved or unwound? I mean, if 99% of the value is transferred, and it's just general partnership interest, or what is there typically an end point for this strategy?
I mean, it totally depends. Let's say, like, it was holding the family real estate
Mhm.
portfolio or closely held business, and then, G1, the members of G1 are gone and everything is sold, and now it just holds cash. Then yeah, maybe, unless you want to keep things going,
Yeah.
right? If you want to keep that structure in place and everyone's on board with someone else becoming the general partner, right? Maybe one of the kids becomes the general partner,
Mhm.
and you still have the 3 or 4 trusts that hold the LP interests involved, right? Maybe then, if it's all cash and no one wants to work together anymore, then it might make sense to just distribute everything out. But if it still makes sense to keep that centralization of management, right? To
Right.
keep that type of asset protection, and
Mhm.
everyone's working together or willing to work together, then, we didn't see them unwound that often.
Mhm. Mhm. Interesting. So I have a question from the audience here, Leslie. And it says, as discussed with real estate transfer into the family LLC or LP, can you transfer real estate into the entity and continue to personally use the real estate? For example, a cabin or a second home?
Yeah. So this type, ultimately or ideally, you can do that, but you would need to use the property in a way that is representative with your economic interest, and allow everybody else who has an economic interest to do the same.
Hmm.
Or you could pay fair market rent to
Mhm.
use the property if you didn't want to use it in the way. Let's say you wanted to use it 100% of the time, right? And you
Mhm.
were just transferring effectively future value, future utility to kids, right? Then you would just be paying fair market rental value for that property. Now, how often do people actually stick to the formalities?
Yeah.
That it doesn't often happen, right? And so that's one of those areas where you see a lot of fuzzier, you know,
Yeah. That's
administration.
interesting. Here in Minnesota, there are a lot of cabins. Now, these cabins are glamorous lake homes worth millions of dollars, on our beautiful 10,000 lakes. So family cabin transfer is a big issue. I could almost see what you're saying. Let's say someone has a beautiful cabin, up north, and they are doing family holding company, LLC, transferring interest, and to keep it real clean, the grantor pays rent. I mean, if they're paying it to that entity, that's really just sort of another wealth transfer, right? I mean, it's almost like the idea of like the defective trust where the grantor is paying the tax on it. It's enhancing the gift even more,
exactly,
really. So,
exactly. And a lot of times what you'll see is
they
people
might not
will
like
get,
the idea of having to pay rent on their own cabin, but from a wealth
no, it's
standpoint,
like a
it's
grantor
helping.
trust almost, right? It's like people will get an inflated value of what the rent is, right? Or if they want to transfer more money, and so or they'll get a deflated value of what they want it to be if they don't want to. So there's a lot more flexibility. Ideally, if you were going to like totally follow the formalities, you would pay fair market rent for your use, or just use it in a representative way that's like representative of your economic interest. Seldom are those formalities followed exactly in that way.
Wow. Well, this has been great. I've really enjoyed it.
Yeah.
We are about at the top of the hour. I wish we had more time. Maybe we can beg you to come back another time. This has been super informative and a lot of fun.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me, Scott.
You bet, Leslie. Take care.
All right. Bye, everybody.
Bye.